Our next speaker is William C. Thompson, who's a professor in the Department of Criminology, Law and Society at the University of California, where he has joint appointments in psychology and in UCI's School of Law. Dr. Thompson is a member of, or has served on the California Crime Laboratory Review Task Force, and he has been a member of the SWIG Speaker, the Scientific Working Group on Speaker Identification. Bill is currently Vice Chair of the NIST Human Factors Committee, and he's also a member of the National Commission's Subcommittee on Human Factors. Professor Thompson?
Thank you. I want to join Dan and the other speakers in saying what an honor it is to be invited to speak to this group. And as a psychologist who's been interested in forensic science for a long time, it's just very gratifying to me that the Academy is expressing such an interest in our field. And I also want to emphasize that all of us who are working on human factors issues in forensic sciences, and particularly those on the OSAC committee and so on, we're approaching it in a spirit of trying to help. The comments that we make may at times sound like criticisms, but please treat those in the spirit in which I hope they're given as an offer to help you think through ways to make your procedures more rigorous and better, more scientific. And that's what we're all about. And we're eager to work with you to address some of the kinds of issues that you've heard about. I want to follow up on what Dan Simon was saying and talk about ways of overcoming bias. And Dan mentioned that a lot of what happens under the hood inside our minds is not something that we can control as well as we think we can. And one of the questions people often raise is, well, if I'm a person of goodwill and good intentions, can't I just overcome any biases by willpower alone? And I'm going to explain why, from the perspective of psychological research, that's not a very good system to rely on, and we probably need to do more. Let me continue talking about what we mean by contextual bias, and I want to expand on it a little bit. Contextual bias means being influenced by unwanted factors. I'm going to say that it's a bias, and we all rely on context to make judgments, but we'll call it a bias when a judgment is influenced by information that's irrelevant to a task. I mean, you're performing a forensic examination, and you're trying to determine whether two samples came from the same source. If you're influenced by the evidence, that's fine, it's not a bias. But if you're influenced by something irrelevant, something that a detective said or something that a lawyer said that isn't relevant to the scientific assessment, I'm going to say that's a bias. It's irrelevant to the task. And as Dan pointed out, there's reason to believe from a lot of research that this kind of influence may occur without our being aware of it. All right? So the influence may be motivational and affect our disposition or motive to reach a particular result, making us, lean in one direction. Or it may be cognitive, affecting just the way we interpret or assess evidence. And this can all occur without our being aware that it's happening. Now, when we talk about the first step in addressing contextual bias, because we're talking about contextual bias being the influence of information that's not task relevant, is to determine what is relevant and not relevant to any particular forensic task. And the Human Factors Committee of OSAC has actually has and will be suggesting to the various OSAC subcommittees and to forensic scientists general that more attention is needed to this issue. We suggest you start thinking carefully in your disciplines about what an expert should and should not rely on. Clearly, it's going to depend in part on what proposition the expert's asked to address. This is a set of propositions that Ian Evatt and his colleagues talked about that forensic scientists are sometimes asked to address. Many forensic scientists are asked to address propositions about the source of some sample, such as, is a suspect the source of the blood stain? In making an inference of this type, what would be task relevant? Well, any information that's relevant to determining the likelihood of observing whatever it is that the forensic scientist will observe under the propositions that the suspect either is or isn't the source is going to be relevant. So there's no desire to deprive forensic scientists of any information they need to assess the evidence that they're asked to assess. So if you're a DNA analyst trying to decide, is this blood sample from this suspect, anything that relates to the probability of getting the profiles you're observing, if it did come from the suspect or if it came from somebody else, would be relevant. But if the detective happens to mention that the person confessed, would that be relevant? I'll say that's not task relevant, because it doesn't help you assess the probability of getting the profiles you're observing under the propositions you're evaluating. Might be relevant to whether the person's guilty or not, and it might be an issue that should be considered by the jury. But for the forensic scientist, what's task relevant is information that influences the likelihood of observing what you are asked to observe as part of your professional duties. Okay. Now, if you're assessing something relating to an activity level hypothesis, like what caused this blood stain pattern, a wider range of things may be relevant to that. There's the appearance of the pattern, maybe the location of the pattern. So that a number of things may need to be considered. But clearly certain things aren't relevant. Is it relevant if you're trying to assess whether it's high velocity spatter? Is it relevant that somebody says, "I think I heard a gunshot"? All right. Well, that's the kind of information we'll say is task irrelevant, because although it may help, it might suggest that it's more likely to be high velocity spatter, but it doesn't help the forensic scientist do the scientific analysis of the likelihood of observing what the forensic scientist is observing under the propositions that are being evaluated. Okay. It's rare, maybe never, that forensic scientists are asked to evaluate propositions about a crime. That's generally a jury's function. Although occasionally maybe not occasionally, commonly medical examiners are asked to assess cause and manner of death, which might involve an even broader range of propositions. Even there, though, it might be, I suggest it might be important for medical examiners to think about clarifying whether their inferences are resting on scientific examination, say medical examinations of the body, versus other information, witness statements, and so on, where the conclusions came from. All right. So just to clarify what I'm talking about with regard to task relevance, OSAC Human Factors Committee will shortly be issuing some guidance documents on this issue of task relevance. And I think they'll say something like this, that information should be considered task relevant if and only if it affects the probability of obtaining the data an expert will examine under the propositions the expert will evaluate. Information, so if you're a DNA analyst, anything that affects the probability of getting those profiles is relevant. Information that affects the probability that a relevant proposition is true, but not the probability of the data under that proposition, is task irrelevant. So if you're a DNA analyst, the fact that the suspect confessed or that another eyewitness identified the suspect, that certainly affects the probability of whether the suspect is the source or not the source of a sample found at the crime scene, say. But it doesn't affect the probability of the scientific data, and therefore it's not relevant to the scientific task. And that's the way we're thinking about this issue. Now, so here's the question, though, and the question to think about is, as forensic scientists, why shouldn't we consider contextual information that's in this task-relevant category? I mean, if I'm a DNA analyst trying to decide if the profiles match and I happen to hear that the suspect confessed and maybe that influences me a little bit, I mean, what's wrong with that? Is that really a problem? And I've had discussions like this with a number of people in the field, and they ask questions like, well, is this really a problem? I could see it's a problem maybe if the information we get is wrong, if somebody tells us something. If somebody tells us the suspect confessed and he didn't, or it was a false confession, as we'll hear about later from Dr. Cass, and that could be misleading. But I'm an intelligent person. I can assess the quality of the information I'm getting. I know that sometimes detectives tell me things that are wrong. If I keep in mind that this investigation might be wrong, is it really a problem? I'm not going to allow myself to be influenced by extraneous information that's not trustworthy, but if it's credible, what does it matter if I'm a little bit influenced by these other things? As one put it, and this I thought particularly telling, is this really a bias if it leads us toward the truth? The DNA analyst is trying to decide if the profiles match, isn't quite sure, but then here's overwhelmingly credible evidence that suggests that the person either is or isn't the source and uses that as a tiebreaker, so to speak. Well, what's wrong with that? Isn't that just moving toward the truth? That's the question I want to ask. And to respond to this question, I want to give an example, a couple of examples. Let's consider two different experts. And I'm going to present them as good expert and bad expert. Let's set up a dichotomy here. Expert number one, and both experts are asked to compare two samples of some sort to determine if they have common source. Expert number one, our good expert, examines the samples carefully, looks at their characteristics, considers the likelihood of obtaining the observed similarities and differences, if they have a same source or different source, and then draws a conclusion accordingly, thinking about if there's a very high probability you would get these concurrences with same source, very low probability with different source, we'll say it's same source or likely to be same source. Now, and I'm going to suggest this is proper expert behavior. The logic here is we'll call it bottom-up. It's from the evidence to the conclusion. It's what Dan Simon called the standard linear model. This is a scientific expert thinking scientifically. So I'm going to call this a scientific inference. And I know there's debate about the validation and quality of the science in some disciplines, but I'm going to say that the basic activity going on here is one we'll call scientific. It's what we want experts to do. Now contrast that with expert number two, who I'll call the bad expert. And this is a really bad expert. What this expert does is consider not the evidence that he or she is asked to examine, but consider all the other investigative facts in the case to judge whether the samples are likely to have a common source. The expert may not even look at the samples that they're asked to be compared, but just talk to the detectives, consider the witness statements, maybe do an investigation of the facts, and then draw conclusions accordingly. All right? So what can we say about this expert? Well, I mean, the logic here, we would call it top-down, or Dan Simon would call this backward reasoning, that the expert considers other evidence which leads to a conclusion and then uses that conclusion to draw conclusions about the evidence. And I'll suggest to you that this approach is fundamentally unscientific. We do not want experts to do this. And hopefully few, if any, forensic scientists would ever do this. I know there are some Fred Zanes and Joyce Gilchrist out there occasionally who are rogues, but this is not scientific, not what we train or want people to do. To the extent somebody did this and presented the conclusion as a scientific conclusion, it would in fact be fraudulent. Okay? So we've got good expert, bad expert. And let me say, I'm not suggesting that there are any bad experts, but I do think that there are some experts, perhaps some here, who, while not acting like expert 2, act like, I'll say, expert 3. We'll call this the hybrid approach. All right, so acting partly like expert 1, but also a little bit like expert 2. So what this expert does is, this expert will examine the evidence like expert number 1 and think about all the scientific considerations, but it will also rely on other evidence in the case like expert 2, maybe to resolve uncertainties or decide how strongly to state conclusions. So this is kind of an integration of the appropriate bottom-up linear reason with the top-down backward reasoning. A little bit of both, okay? And so what would we say about this? This expert is being partly scientific, but partly not. Is this how we want experts to behave? And I pose that as a question for you. Think about it. My sense is that we do not want experts to behave this way, that this actually undermines the scientific quality of the evidence that's being presented in court to the extent experts do that. And therefore, it undermines the quality of evidence that we as forensic scientists can present to triers of fact. It makes the contribution of forensic science less valuable because it mixes something that's fundamentally scientific with something that's not scientific. All right? It's not the forensic scientist who has to make the decision as to whether somebody's guilty or not guilty. The ultimate decision is made by the jury. The forensic scientist is just one person feeding evidence to the jury, and we want the contribution of the forensic scientist to be independent from the other pieces of evidence. That makes it stronger, and we want it to have a scientific quality. To the extent that forensic scientists are influenced by this extraneous information, that's bad, and it reduces the quality of what we present. At least that's my argument. Nevertheless, I think that some forensic scientists fall into this role of expert number 3 and act like expert number 3. And how do I know that? I think that there are two ways that you can end up acting like expert number 3. Some people do it explicitly, perhaps because they don't know better or haven't thought it through. So there can be a knowing and intentional use of task-irrelevant information, and I think that some experts do this. Why do I think this? Because they say that they're doing it. I mean, so some people will admit to doing it, and the other way to do it is implicitly. You fall into this because, as Dan Simon said, this kind of backwards reasoning is going on inside your mind without your being fully aware of it. You're influenced by other factors without knowing it because you're engaging in your work in a way that's not adequately rigorous. Okay, so let's talk about explicit bias. Here's a quick example of a forensic scientist talking about acting like expert number 3. This is a forensic odontologist. And in testimony from a case in 2012. So fairly recent testimony, and what he's saying is if I do a bite mark analysis, and I think I might call it an inclusion, but if I hear there's also DNA evidence supporting my conclusion, then I'll upgrade my opinion. I'll say it's stronger than it was before. All right. So this is expert number 3. Admission of an expert number 3, and I think this is not appropriate. But I actually had the opportunity to speak a couple of weeks ago to the person who made this statement. Actually, a charming, intelligent man, and we had a conversation about whether this is appropriate for a forensic scientist. He promised me that he would rethink the issue. I think all of us should rethink about this issue. I think we, all right. Let's just amplify on this. I may not need to do this at this point, but to see what's wrong with the odontologist's use of DNA evidence, think about why the DNA evidence is relevant to his conclusion about the bite mark. The logic is this: well, the DNA matches the defendant, so the defendant must be the perpetrator, and if the defendant is the perpetrator, then he must be the source of the bite mark. That's the logic. It's backwards logic. It's the top-down logic. Fundamentally unscientific. So to allow this to happen means to mix the scientific work with unscientific inferences, which I will argue is improper. Okay? So, all right. How do we address this problem in order to protect the scientific character of our work? For the explicit kind of bias I talked about, I think we do need better training. I'd like to see more discussion of these issues of what is task relevant and should be considered and shouldn't. I'd like to see more of it in forensic science textbooks, in the literature, and so on. And I think the discussion that will emerge from the interaction between the human factors committee and the other subcommittees on OSAC may go a long way to clarifying these issues for the field. So standards that are developed for the various subdisciplines, I think, should address this issue, what experts should and shouldn't be considering in order to maintain the scientific character and quality of the work. With regard to the implicit or inadvertent influence, as Dan Simon pointed out, that's a little harder to address. To rely simply on human willpower is likely not going to work very well. We can't will away these biases because often we don't realize that they are occurring. You can't intentionally avoid doing something that when it happens without your knowledge of it. Okay? We can be powerfully influenced by this contextual information, as Dan pointed out, and there are many examples. We often are unaware that it's happening. Okay? So, people who say things like, I would never allow myself to be influenced by something I heard from a police officer. They're showing good intentions, but this is also showing a certain level of what I'd call psychological naivete. It's failing to recognize established findings from cognitive science and psychology that show that we're not very good about doing these things. I heard somebody say, I'm not influenced by that kind of information. I've examined my conscience. My conscience is clear. Well, your conscience may be clear, but that's no guarantee that your conclusions are based on what you think that they're based on, okay? There is, as Dan said, this introspection illusion, a blind spot for our biases. And in the interest of time, I'm going to skip ahead. But basically, we're not very good at recognizing what's going on inside our brains. There's evidence from all kinds of different areas of psychology that we can be influenced in our judgments and decisions without being aware of it. And I don't have time to go over the studies, but everything from consumer studies to romantic attraction shows us that we can be influenced without knowing we're influenced by various factors. If we want to avoid being influenced by these factors, we should move either toward objective standards for assessment, or if the processes must rely to some extent on subjective judgment, move toward or think about procedures for what's called context management. Manage the flow of information to the analyst so the analyst is shielded or protected, at least temporarily, at least while making the critical subjective judgments, is shielded from information that's potentially biasing. So reduce exposure to the task-relevant information. There are many different kinds of task-irrelevant information that might reach the forensic scientist. I'm running out of time, so I won't go over all of these, but the people who have worked in this field have developed a number of techniques and procedures that I think are feasible and viable for dealing with these problems. My suggestion for the field is think about this. Talk with the Human Factors Committee, and let's start a discussion of whether it's practical and how to protect forensic scientists from these unwanted biases that are going to undermine the scientific quality of their work. The OSAC Human Factors Committee, I think, is available to play a role in this. It has a number of people who are interested in ways of understanding human performance and improving organizational performance. It's a motley-looking crew, but there's a lot of expertise in this group. And as Dan Simon said, it's not just about bias, it's about a wide range of issues that might involve human judgment. You have to understand, to be a good scientist, you have to understand the operating characteristics of the instruments you use. But what's the most important instrument in forensic science? It's the human mind. All right. Use it carefully. Thank you.